to the House.
Speaker.
I understand this is a split call.
No, I don't believe it is.
It's not. In that case, I call the honourable member Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow is Women's Suffrage Day, and the reason why I put that on record at the beginning of the debate, of my contribution to the debate on this particular bill, is that sadly, all too often, the public who we will be protecting in this instance with this bill will be the women of New Zealand, sadly, and in far too many instances. Because, of course, this bill, the public protection orders, are designed to be used for the worst of sexual and violent offences and the offenders who commit those. And not always, but mainly, we do find that those offenders are men and that their victims are women. So it is important that we reflect on the eve of Women's Suffrage Day about how much more we still need to do in this area, because in my view and in the view of my Labour colleagues, we cannot say that we've made fantastic progress on women's issues until women can feel safe in their communities, can feel safe in their homes, can feel safe in their communities. That until that very basic fundamental human right is afforded to every New Zealand citizen, including women, then we really cannot pretend that we've made the sort of progress that we need to make. Mr. Speaker, I would much rather be standing here speaking on a bill that actually addresses, it actually stops these offences from taking place in the first place, because sadly, by the time we're talking about these public protection orders, far too many women, children and others who are vulnerable in our society will have already been hurt by the offenders who we are applying the public protection orders to. And it does actually worry me that we spend a lot of time under the term of this government debating ambulance at the bottom of the cliff type approaches to addressing violence and sexual violence in our community. And I can't remember the last time I was on my feet debating a bill put forward by this government that actually was designed to and had the purpose of getting in front of all of that and actually putting in some legislative measures and some policy measures that would actually stop the hurt from happening in the first place. So, Mr. Speaker, that is my wish on the eve of Women's Suffrage Day, that this Parliament and that this government would focus more on stopping the hurt from happening in the first place than spending the many, many hours that we do debating the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff that we are going to put in place to actually keep punishing people who have already hurt far too many people in our society. So I guess that's really the context in which I debate this bill. Labor is, however, supporting this bill to select committee. This is the first reading, and we want to have the opportunity to engage, as we haven't been able to so far, in the design of a bill like this that is aiming at, I think, between the 5 to 12 most serious offenders in this regard. It is of concern to me, Mr. Speaker, that since the government went out and campaigned during the election on this bill, as they want to do, they want to sound like they're tough on crime, that makes them feel better somehow. I'd rather that we actually stop the crime from happening in the first place, but this government's focused on, dealing with the aftermath and the effects of crime after it's happened. That is really where they come from on this. But since they campaigned in the 2011 election to take this very measure, that one of those offenders that this is actually aimed at has actually finished his jail term and doesn't have this to be this measure to be applied to him. Stuart Murray Wilson, it is who I'm referring to. That measure has not been available because this government has taken its sweet time to actually even start the first reading of this bill. And I do think that is worrying, because this bill does have the support of many parties in this House and could have been proceeded an awful lot faster had the government had the will to do so. But it didn't seem that that will has been there until quite recently. So here we are at the first reading. Labor will support it to select committee, but we do so with a warning to the government that we know actually from past experience that with bills like this we can make an awful lot more progress if parties are consulted in the drafting of the bill before it actually hits the House. That we could actually fast-track and proceed in a better way with this type of legislation. And I know the Minister doesn't agree. She doesn't like the idea of cross-party support for any of these measures. But where it does exist, the Minister should actually take advantage of that. If she was a good Minister, she would take advantage of that and actually make sure that we had a bill that came into the House that had the goodwill and support of the parties who do want to support it, and then we would have, I think, much better select committee processes in place. But it will be very interesting to see what submitters do have to say on this bill, because I think that the fact that it hasn't had wide consultation will mean that there will be issues that will need to be addressed, and of course that is what the Select Committee process is for. However, a better government, a more open government, a more accessible government would actually do better consultation at the outset. And that is certainly the history that the Labour Party brings to this particular issue. So what does the bill do? Well, the bill empowers the High Court to issue a public protection order that would allow for detention of a person in a secure facility for a potentially indefinite time frame. So these are very serious issues, Mr Speaker, that we are addressing in this bill. There are fundamental issues around human rights and around making sure that, that indefinite timeframes are used appropriately, albeit the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff approach to this issue. The bill is a proportionate balance, and that's why it would have been a good idea for parties to have had some input into this before it hit the debating chamber. A proportionate balance between the state's legitimate objective of protecting citizens, which is an important function for this House, from almost certain serious sexual or violent harm, and the right of those on a public protection order to be subject to the least restrictive form of detention to achieve that objective. So that's the balance that we must strike here. That is the balance that we must strike, and I feel we would have been better prepared for had there been that consultation. While it is possible that detainees will never be released from a public protection order, there are, though, some pathways for their release, and those pathways would include a management plan, as others have already said, rehabilitation, treatment, regular and early review of status and post-release supervision. But, Mr Speaker, wouldn't it be good if we didn't have to debate these issues at all in this Parliament? Wouldn't it be great, Mr Speaker, if instead we got at the front end of it? At the front end, if we were doing that properly, we wouldn't have the police actually stopping last year from reporting the incidents of domestic violence and family violence in their annual report. Because all of the literature on this issue, Minister, tells us that the more we know about domestic violence and its impacts and what causes it and how we get to that point, the better we will be to address it as a society and to stop it in its path. Mr Speaker, those are the sorts of measures that we ought to be taking in this Parliament. Instead, that government is busy actually stopping the information from being known at the outset. If we do not know, and if we sweep it under the carpet, and if we try to look the other way, as the police annual report is attempting to do, instead of getting to grips with this very ugly black problem that we do have in New Zealand, then we will continue to be debating these ambulance at the bottom of the cliff type bills instead of getting in front of the issue, instead of stopping the harm, instead of stopping the hurt. We will continue to deal with the aftermath.
I call the